She took the job because the ad promised a generous salary, a private cottage, and a single 7-year-old student who needed patience more than curriculum. What the agency never mentioned was the boy's last name, or the fact that the moment his father stepped out from behind his study door, Emma Hale's carefully rebuilt life would collapse in the space of a single breath. "Miss Hale, this is Mr. Whitfield," the housekeeper announced. And the man who turned from the window, tall and gaunt in a way grief carves into people, was not a stranger at all. He was Daniel. The Daniel who had once promised her a lifetime and instead vanished into his father's empire without a single word of explanation. 11 years ago. The week after she told him she loved him for the first time. "Emma," he said, his voice breaking on the single syllable, and behind him, peering curiously around the doorframe, stood a small solemn boy with Daniel's exact gray eyes and none of his father's ability to hide what he was feeling. She had come to teach a lonely child how to read poetry and long division. She had no idea she was about to relearn everything she thought she understood about the man who broke her heart, and the reasons he disappeared that she had spent 11 years getting wrong. Hello, my dear friends. If you've ever discovered that the story you told yourself about your own heartbreak wasn't the whole truth, this one is for you. I'm your host, and today we're stepping into a story about grief, second chances, and the particular ache of learning that the person who left you was carrying a burden far heavier than you ever knew. If it resonates, give this video a like before we begin, and let's get into it. The gates of Ashworth Manor swung open on a gray October morning, revealing a long gravel drive bordered by oak trees just beginning to turn, and Emma Hale sat in the back of the hired car clutching a manila folder of lesson plans like a shield, trying to steady the strange unease that had settled over her since the agency first described the position 3 weeks earlier. She was 33, a former elementary school teacher who'd spent the last 4 years building a quiet, careful reputation as a private tutor for children the traditional system had failed, children who learned differently, children who'd stopped speaking after losing someone, children the world had labeled difficult before anyone bothered asking why. The Whitfield position had come through her usual agency with unusual secrecy attached, a non-disclosure agreement she'd signed before ever learning her employer's full name, a generous salary that made her ask twice whether the listing had a typo, and a single instruction repeated twice in the contract. The child needs consistency and patience above all else. Do not rush him. She had assumed, reasonably, that Whitfield was simply another wealthy family protecting their privacy. She had not, in 3 weeks of preparation, once considered that the name might be an alias, chosen the same careful way she'd once heard a young man mention, years and years ago, that families like his sometimes used a mother's maiden name to keep tabloids away from anything that actually mattered. The manor itself was less imposing than she'd expected from the outside. Elegant stone softened by ivy and neglected rose beds that suggested a household too consumed by something else to keep up appearances anymore. A woman in her 60s with kind, tired eyes met her at the door. "Miss Hale, welcome. I'm Constance, the house manager. We've been expecting you." She led Emma through a wide entrance hall, hushed and dim despite the morning light. "Master Theo has been looking forward to your arrival, though he won't admit it directly. He's not one for enthusiasm these days." "How long has it been?" Emma asked carefully, recalling the sparse details in her contract. A boy who had stopped speaking in full sentences 6 months earlier, after a loss the paperwork referred to only as a significant family bereavement. 7 months since his mother passed," Constance said quietly. The school couldn't manage him afterward. Too many questions from the other children, too much silence from Theo. His father decided homeschooling with the right kind of teacher might give him room to heal without an audience. Emma's chest tightened with the particular ache she always felt for grieving children, the ones who learned too young that the world kept spinning indifferently around their worst days. "I'll do everything I can for him." "His father would like to meet you first," Constance said, pausing outside a heavy oak door. "He's rarely home during the day, but he insisted on being here for your arrival. He's quite particular about who spends time with Theo." Constance knocked once, then pushed the door open, and Emma stepped into a study lined with books and soft autumn light, her professional smile already arranging itself, until the man standing at the window turned around, and every carefully rebuilt piece of her composure shattered at once. "Miss Hale, this is Mr. Whitfield," Constance said, oblivious to the seismic shift occurring in the room. Daniel Ashworth, heir to one of the largest private equity firms on the eastern seaboard, a man Emma had once known simply as Daniel, a philosophy student who quoted Rilke badly and made her laugh until her ribs ached, stood frozen by the window, his gray eyes wide with the exact same disbelief Emma felt rising in her own throat. "Emma," he said, her name breaking on his lips like something long held underwater finally surfacing. Neither of them spoke for a long suspended moment. Constance glanced between them, sensing something she couldn't name, and quietly excused herself, closing the door softly behind her. "You're Whitfield," Emma finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course you are. Whitfield was your mother's name. I use it to keep Theo out of the tabloids," Daniel said, moving toward her, then stopping himself as though remembering suddenly that he no longer had any right to close that particular distance. "Emma, I had no idea the agency would send you specifically. I asked for their best specialist in grief-related learning delays. I didn't know. I should go," Emma said, the words arriving before she'd fully decided them, 11 years of carefully buried hurt rising fast and hot in her chest. "This is completely inappropriate. Find another tutor. Please," Daniel said, and something in his voice, raw and desperate in a way she'd never once heard from the composed, careful young man she'd loved at 22, stopped her at the door. "Just meet him first. Please, Emma. Whatever happened between us, he didn't do anything to deserve losing this chance too." Emma turned back, torn between the instinct to flee and 11 years of professional discipline that had taught her, above almost everything else, that a grieving child's needs mattered more than her own discomfort in any given room. That was when she noticed the boy standing quietly in the doorway behind his father, small and solemn, watching the strange adult tension with the particular alertness of a child who has learned that grown-up silences usually mean something important is happening. "Hello," Emma said softly, crouching slightly to meet his eyes, forcing her voice into the gentle, steady register she used with every frightened child she'd ever taught. "You must be Theo." "I'm Emma." Theo studied her with his father's exact gray eyes, solemn and searching, then, after a long pause, offered a single small nod, the closest thing to a greeting Emma would learn, over the following days, that he currently offered anyone. If you've ever walked back into a room you thought you'd closed the door on forever, only to find it still held pieces of your own heart, hit that like button. And if you believe healing sometimes finds us in the most unexpected reunions, subscribe for more stories like this one. Emma agreed to stay for the first week, telling herself unconvincingly that it was purely a professional decision, that Theo's needs outweighed her own discomfort, that she was simply too experienced with exactly this kind of grief to walk away from a child who so clearly needed her specific expertise. The truth, she admitted to herself alone that first night in the small guest cottage on the estate grounds, was more complicated. Some part of her, buried under 11 years of careful distance, wanted to understand finally why Daniel Ashworth had disappeared from her life without a single word, the week after she'd told him, for the first time, that she loved him. She had met him at 22, both of them finishing graduate degrees at the same small liberal arts college, Emma in education, Daniel ostensibly in philosophy, though even then she'd sensed the careful weight of his family's expectations pressing against every choice he made. He'd been unlike the wealthy students she occasionally encountered, unpretentious, curious, genuinely more interested in ideas than status, and for 18 months, they had built something Emma had believed, with the complete certainty of young love, was permanent. Then, 3 days after she told him she loved him, standing in the rain outside her apartment because he'd said the words needed saying properly, in person without hesitation, Daniel had simply stopped answering his phone. 2 weeks later, a curt email arrived, informing her that he'd need to focus entirely on the family business moving forward, that continuing their relationship wouldn't be fair to either of them, that he wished her every happiness. She had spent the better part of a year believing she'd simply misjudged him entirely, that the careful, thoughtful young man she'd loved had never actually existed beneath the practiced charm of someone destined, eventually, to become exactly the kind of cold, transactional person his family's world seemed to produce with such reliable consistency. Now, 11 years later, standing in his study watching him fail to hide the devastation in his own eyes, Emma found herself uncertain, for the first time in over a decade, whether that story had ever been entirely true. The days that followed settled into a careful rhythm. Mornings began with lessons in the estate's sun-filled conservatory, Emma patiently coaxing Theo through reading exercises disguised as adventure stories, discovering quickly that the boy possessed a sharp, curious mind buried beneath layers of careful silence, the particular armor grieving children build when the adults around them seem too fragile themselves to hold space for a child's enormous, complicated sorrow. He hasn't cried since the funeral, Daniel told her quietly on the third evening, finding her in the library after Theo had gone to bed. Not once. The therapists say it's concerning, that he needs to process it eventually, but every time I try to talk to him about his mother, he just goes quiet and stares at his hands. Grief doesn't follow a schedule, Emma said carefully, maintaining the professional distance she'd been determined to hold since her arrival. Especially not for children this young. He needs to feel safe before he'll feel anything else. Does he feel safe with you? Daniel asked, something vulnerable and hopeful threading through the question that Emma chose, deliberately, not to examine too closely. It's early, she said instead. Give it time. Over the following 2 weeks, Emma watched something in Theo begin, slowly, carefully, to unlock. He started initiating conversations during their lessons, first about the adventure stories she chose specifically to build trust before introducing harder material, then gradually about small fragments of his mother, a favorite song she used to hum while cooking, a particular blue scarf she'd worn every winter, small treasured pieces of a person Emma was beginning to understand Theo desperately needed permission to remember out loud. My mom used to read this one, Theo said quietly one afternoon, holding up a worn picture book Emma had pulled at random from the nursery shelf. Before she got too sick to read anymore. Emma sat very still, recognizing the significance of the moment, the first time in 2 weeks Theo had volunteered a memory unprompted. Would you like to tell me about her? Only if you want to. Theo considered this with the same solemn deliberation Emma had come to recognize as entirely his father's expression transplanted onto a much younger face. She had a laugh that sounded like it surprised her every time, he said finally. Like she wasn't expecting to be that happy. That sounds like a wonderful sound to remember, Emma said softly, her chest tight with an emotion she couldn't fully name. Watching this small, brave boy begin the long, necessary work of holding his grief instead of hiding from it. She learned, in pieces over those 2 weeks, the fuller story of what had happened to Daniel's family since she'd last known him. His father, Richard Ashworth, had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia the same month Emma had told Daniel she loved him, a fact Daniel had kept from her entirely, choosing instead to disappear rather than explain a crisis he didn't yet know how to carry. My father's board of directors gave him an ultimatum, Daniel explained one evening, the two of them sharing tea in the kitchen after Theo had finally, exhaustedly fallen asleep following a long afternoon of quiet tears. The first real crying Emma had witnessed since her arrival, triggered gently, carefully, by a conversation about his mother's favorite song. Either I formally entered the company immediately, trained under him while his mind was still sharp enough to teach me, or the board would push him out entirely, humiliate him publicly, dismantle everything he'd spent 40 years building. I was 23. I panicked. You could have told me, Emma said quietly, old hurt resurfacing despite 11 years of practice distance. Instead of just disappearing. I know, Daniel said, his voice heavy with a regret that sounded, Emma noted despite herself, entirely genuine. I told myself I was protecting you from a mess. I didn't understand myself yet. That you deserved someone who could give you his whole attention. Not someone drowning in his father's crisis. I convinced myself walking away clean was kinder than dragging you into it. It wasn't kinder, Emma said. It was just easier for you. Daniel flinched but didn't argue. You're right. I was a coward who mistook running for protecting someone. I've had 11 years to understand that distinction, Emma. I understood it a little too late to matter. What happened with your father? Emma asked, curiosity and old wounds tangling together in her chest. He held on for 6 more years before the disease took too much, Daniel said quietly. I married Sophia 2 years into running the company, mostly because my father, in one of his last lucid periods, was terrified of leaving me completely alone in a world he knew would try to consume me the way it nearly consumed him. Sophia was kind, practical, a good partner in the ways that mattered for the life I was building. We grew to love each other. Differently than I once loved you, but genuinely. And then she got sick, Emma said softly, filling in the parts Constance had already gently explained. Ovarian cancer diagnosed too late, Daniel said, his voice cracking slightly. 18 months from diagnosis to the funeral. Theo was 6. He doesn't fully understand yet that she's not coming back from wherever grown-ups tell children sick people go. Emma reached across the table instinctively, then caught herself, pulling back before her hand fully met his. I'm sorry, Daniel. Truly. For all of it, your father, Sophia, everything you've carried since I last knew you. I don't deserve your sympathy, Daniel said. Not after how I left things. But I am glad, selfishly, achingly glad, that whatever brought you back into this house, even through circumstances neither of us chose, gave me the chance to finally tell you the truth. The tension between them, carefully professional during daylight hours, grew harder to maintain as October deepened into November. As Emma watched Theo slowly, painstakingly reclaim pieces of himself she suspected even Daniel hadn't realized were missing, as she watched Daniel, in unguarded moments, look at her with an expression that carried 11 years of accumulated regret and something else, something warmer, that frightened her considerably more than the regret did. He asked me today if you were going to be his new mom, Daniel told her one evening in late November, his tone carefully neutral in a way that didn't quite mask the hope beneath it. Emma's breath caught. What did you tell him? That you're his teacher and an extraordinary one, and that whatever else might happen someday isn't something either of us needs to decide today. Daniel studied her carefully across the kitchen table. Was that the right answer? It was an honest one, Emma said carefully, which is more than I can say for how things ended between us the first time. I know I have no right to ask for anything beyond your professional patience with my son, Daniel said quietly. But I need you to know, Emma, that walking away from you 11 years ago is the single decision in my entire life I regret most completely. Not because of everything it cost me personally, though it cost me plenty, but because of who I became in the process. Careful, guarded, so afraid of losing control of anything that mattered that I nearly forgot how to actually let anything matter at all. And now? Emma asked, her voice barely steady. Now I have a son who's finally learning to grieve out loud because of your patience, Daniel said. And I have 11 years of proof that running from hard things doesn't actually protect anyone. It just delays the reckoning. He met her eyes directly. I'm not asking you to forgive me tonight, Emma. I'm asking for the chance to keep earning it, one honest day at a time, the way I should have fought for you the first time instead of disappearing. The following weeks brought small, deliberate changes. Daniel began arranging his schedule to be present for more of Theo's lessons, not overseeing them exactly, but simply present, learning alongside his son the particular patience grief required. Theo, sensing the shifting warmth in the household, began sleeping through the night for the first time since his mother's death, began drawing again elaborate, careful pictures of a woman with dark hair and a wide, surprised smile that Emma understood without needing to ask, was his careful, ongoing way of keeping his mother present in a house determined not to erase her. On a cold evening in early December, Emma found Theo in the conservatory long after his usual bedtime, sitting alone in the dark, clutching the worn picture book his mother used to read. Couldn't sleep? Emma asked gently, settling beside him. I had a dream about her, Theo said quietly, his voice small. And when I woke up, I forgot for a second that she was gone. Then I remembered, and it felt like losing her all over again. Emma wrapped an arm carefully around his small shoulders, feeling him lean into the contact with the particular trust that had taken 2 months of patient, careful work to build. That happens sometimes, she said softly. Missing someone doesn't get smaller just because time passes. But I promise you it does get easier to carry. Especially when you let the people who love you help carry it with you. Like you? Theo asked, looking up at her with his father's exact eyes. Like me, Emma confirmed, her throat tight with an emotion she could no longer pretend was purely professional. And like your dad who loves you more than anything else in this entire world. Even when grief makes it hard for grown-ups to know exactly what to say. Theo was quiet for a long moment, then asked the question Emma had been quietly dreading and hoping for in equal measure. Do you love my dad? Emma considered the question with the same careful honesty she brought to every difficult conversation with a grieving child, understanding suddenly and completely that Theo deserved the truth as much as his father did. I loved him once a long time ago, she said carefully. And I'm still figuring out what I feel now that we've found each other again. But I know I care about both of you very much, and that whatever happens, I'm not planning on disappearing from your life anytime soon." Theo nodded solemnly, apparently satisfied with an answer that acknowledged uncertainty without abandoning him to it. Then, in a gesture that undid Emma completely, leaned his small head against her shoulder and, for the first time since her arrival, finally allowed himself to cry, quietly, thoroughly, safely, the accumulated grief of 7 long months finally finding a space patient enough to hold it. Daniel found them there 20 minutes later, Theo finally asleep against Emma's shoulder, and the expression on his face, watching his son finally release the grief he'd been carrying silently for so long, safe in the arms of the one woman Daniel had never stopped loving despite 11 years and a lifetime of careful distance, told Emma everything she needed to know about where his heart had remained unmoved through every year of their separation. "Thank you," Daniel whispered, carefully lifting his sleeping son to carry him to bed. "For giving him what I couldn't figure out how to give him myself. He just needed someone patient enough to wait for it," Emma said softly. "The same thing you needed 11 years ago, if I'm being honest. Someone patient enough to wait for the truth instead of accepting the version you were too afraid to correct." Daniel paused in the doorway, Theo's small form cradled carefully against his chest. "Is there still a chance for that? For us, waiting for the truth instead of accepting the easier version?" Emma considered the question seriously, weighing 11 years of hurt against 2 months of watching this man rebuild himself, patiently, honestly, in service of his grieving son, watching him choose vulnerability over control at every turn she'd witnessed since her arrival. "I think," she said slowly, "I'd like to find out." Their relationship, when it finally began in earnest, unfolded with the same careful deliberateness Daniel now brought to every important decision in his life: quiet dinners after Theo's bedtime, long conversations on the terrace working through 11 years of accumulated history, the slow, patient rebuilding of trust between two people who understood, better than most, exactly how much damage careless silence could cause. 6 months after Emma first walked through the gates of Ashworth Manor believing she'd been hired simply to teach a lonely child his letters, Daniel proposed to her in the conservatory where she and Theo had spent so many patient mornings together. Theo himself, now 8 years old and considerably more talkative, standing proudly beside his father holding the ring box, having been let in on the secret plan for exactly one very serious, very important week. "I know I don't deserve a second chance after how I handled the first one," Daniel said, kneeling before her with Theo's small hand resting solemnly on his shoulder. "But I've spent every day these past 6 months trying to become someone worthy of asking anyway. Emma Hale, will you marry me? Not because it's convenient or because Theo needs a mother, though he does love you dearly, but because you are and have always been the truest thing I ever let myself walk away from, and I don't intend to make that particular mistake twice. Please say yes," Theo added seriously, causing both adults to laugh through their tears. "Because I already told my class you're going to be my mom, and it would be really embarrassing to take it back." Emma, laughing and crying in equal measure, pulled them both into an embrace that felt, finally, like the family none of them had known they were still capable of building after so much loss and so many years of careful, guarded distance. "Yes," she said simply, "to both of you." They married the following spring in the same conservatory, surrounded by the roses Emma had spent months patiently coaxing back to life alongside Theo, who insisted on serving as ring bearer while wearing, at his own careful insistence, a small blue scarf that had once belonged to his mother, a gentle, deliberate way of ensuring Sophia remained present, honored, and remembered on the happiest day either of them could recall. If you've ever believed the story you told yourself about your own heartbreak was the whole truth, only to discover years later that the person who hurt you was carrying a burden heavier than you ever knew. I hope this story reminds you that healing sometimes arrives disguised as the very reunion we never expected to need. Sometimes the family we're meant to build was simply waiting for both of us to finally tell the truth. If this story touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe for more stories just like it. And let me know in the comments, have you ever discovered a deeper truth behind someone's decision to walk away from you? Until next time, remember that the most meaningful second chances rarely arrive the way we expect them to. Sometimes they arrive quietly, patiently, in the space between a lonely child's silence and the courage it takes to finally let someone in. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.